The script is your map of the world, isn't it? And if someone knows that if it's well written, you get all of the beats, it will tell you everything you need to know. Gary Oldman.
You're listening to Writing Roots, brought to you by Aspen House Publishing.
Welcome to Writing Roots. I'm Lee Hull.
And I'm Lee Esses. Today and next episode, we'll be talking about some questions that we've gotten throughout the year that don't really fit into any particular season that we've done. And it's sort of a conglomerate of all of the questions that we got. A lot of these questions have to do with how do I format reading a newspaper headline? How do I format numbers? How do I format text messages? These kinds of things. So we're just covering this episode and next, weird formatting.
In your first draft, do whatever works best for you. Do whatever you need to so you remember this is a newspaper headline or this is a text message or whatever. In your editing phases, when you're formatting, you can start pondering this question. But if you have a publisher, then do whatever the publisher tells you to do, or they are going to do it for you.
Publishers will pick between the Chicago style or the AP style or the MLA or the APA or Oxford or all of these different kinds of styles as far as the nuances that we're talking about. So if you know you're going to stick to a particular style, feel free to pick up a reference book, and that wins over anything we're telling you this week.
I will say that in general, publishers go with the Chicago style.
And I do want to put a little footnote in there that we are talking about fiction. Most of our listeners are fiction. We acknowledge that there are very different rules for nonfiction.
So a lot of the answer that you are going to find to this question of how to format the weird things will depend on how your point of view character is absorbing whatever the information is. Are they hearing it through dialogue? Are they seeing it written down? Is it coming through a text message? Or is it some other way that they're understanding it and experiencing that type of communication?
So, for instance, you can say something like, you can lead a horse to water. Your character is quoting a common proverb. How would you format that? Probably italics or nothing at all, depending on how repeated that particular phrase is within the story.
Or you have something like, buy now, today, where it's clearly an advertisement, so you're probably going to have that in all caps or in italics. Something that will bring attention and show you that it's a written advertisement that they're seeing.
And then you will have your character who is just thinking or experiencing the world in some way. They're sitting down and making a decision. They're thinking, is writing a Dear John letter too cliche? That kind of thing. You can put little single quotes around Dear John. You can put it in italics. You can just capitalize it because then we can feel like it's a proper noun. There are a lot of ways to do that. But when we're talking about your character understanding or experiencing it without hearing it or seeing it, that's the kind of internal monologue that we're talking about.
If your character is reading it and they're seeing the text in formatting, then you have a little bit more freedom to do what you want here. Take text messages, for example. Sometimes I will see text messages within the text of a book, the final formatting, do the chat bubble thing back and forth. So you can see that it is that messaging back and forth. And it gives you the freedom to do things like include typos, because who's going to type out a perfectly written text message?
You will.
We will, but not everybody. Not everybody is as particular about writing as we are. And if you want to get creative with that kind of formatting, then this is where you can do it. You can do it with those text messages. You can do it with the billboards. You can do it with the newspapers and have a visual representation, maybe in a little more simplified form, of that written message that the character is experiencing. So the reader can then experience it in a very similar way.
So we're going to break this down into two major groups, either small doses of text or references or quotes, those kind of things, or large doses. So a newspaper headline versus a newspaper column.
In the small doses, my preference is just to have it be part of the paragraph, part of the text, just a standard way of writing it. If you're dealing with written communication, you'll probably want to do something like italics so that it does identify it as something different, but it's still there. So I think this is what I did when I was doing text messages in Toxic and Katie ratio, because I didn't have many of them, but I still wanted to show that kind of conversation between the two characters. So any of their text messages, I wrote it in italics, formatting in a very similar way as if they were having the conversation through dialogue.
The other way you'll see it, you can sometimes have small caps for things like an advertisement, the buy now on the billboard or the headlines in the newspaper, these kinds of things. Small caps are a special type of formatting. In your first draft, you can just hit caps lock, and then as you're going through it, you can do the small caps thing in editing. But that small caps helps it pop without feeling like shouting, and it can make it feel like something is coming at the character, not necessarily coming at the reader.
So if you're unfamiliar with what we mean by small caps, we mean the text is written in a font that is the same height as the normal letters, but each individual letter itself is the capitalized version of that letter.
The next part of the small doses we're going to talk about are when the character hears it, not necessarily seeing it, but if you're hearing it, let's say in dialogue or that kind of thing, a radio, whatever. This breaks down based on the number of words more than the content. If it's 2-3 words, you can do the single quotes. Or if you're having a crowd shout a bunch of things at once and you have it all in the same sentence, you can do double quotes around the phrases. Whereas if it's longer, like something that's a translation or there's subtext or a code that 2 of the characters understand but the third doesn't, that one will be more in italics.
And then the final category of small doses of formatting is text messages. This really comes down to preference. Some publishers are doing this graphically with the back and forth chat bubbles, but you don't have to do that. That does take a lot of work to get formatted correctly.
I have seen some publishers choose to put this in quotes so it feels like dialogue instead of just a text message exchange, and we understand that it's like a phone call but not.
I like to put it in italics instead of quotes so it differentiates it from a face-to-face conversation, but otherwise it's formatted the same as that face-to-face conversation.
I've also seen people use small caps. I feel like this would only make sense if one of the participants in the conversation either has poor eyesight or is a boomer or older.
Occasionally, you will see people kind of split the difference between graphically showing the full text bubbles and just leaving it normal and format it mostly normally. But they'll have little quirks like a username in parentheses along with a sentence, and then they'll go back and forth and maybe have inset margins for the segment of back and forth text messaging. But generally, it is formatted within the narrative text with the left justified and indented on the first line.
The other chunk of this are the large doses. When you have a big wall of text, your character is reading a blog or looking at this newspaper article, these kinds of things.
In general, you want to avoid this one, especially if there is only a little bit of information that is going to actually be relevant. You can have the headline and the first line and then just summarize the rest of the text because it's more important the response to the thing rather than the thing itself. But if you have to include it all because it is very important, there are things you can do to set it apart.
The first thing that you're going to see is an indent both on the left and the right side for the whole wall of text. This makes it feel a little bit more like a newspaper column where it's narrow but kind of long. And you'll sometimes see a little bit of paragraph break before and after, depending on how the publisher chooses to do it. But that indent on both sides makes it very clear when just glancing at the page how long this article is going to be.
This is something you'll often use for an online article or a newspaper or maybe a written letter of some kind. But it's usually chunks of text that are more than 4 lines long. Occasionally, you will see people visually format this similar to the chat bubbles where they'll actually have visual representations of the letter or the newspaper and make it look like an image of the thing. But that does take a lot of work. You don't have to do that. Simple indentation and then often a little bit of italicized lettering can help convey the same idea without all the extra work.
And we do want to point out this is something that either you have written or is public domain. The character is reading a Bible passage or something. This should not be something where you have to reference another author because of copyright and blah, blah, blah. That makes it start to feel like a nonfiction book. Then there's a whole bunch of other rules for citations and blah, blah, blah. We're not going to get into that because, again, we're talking narrative fiction today.
If you are quoting something within dialogue, you can use the quote within a quote. That's usually quotation marks on the outside and then the apostrophes on the inside. But you'll want to be careful how you do this because it can look weird, throw people off, and just overall be difficult.
You can also do italics if they're quoting something that has subtext attached to it, something like a Bible verse or a proverb, that kind of thing. You can do italics for it, especially if it's a translation or a motto that they're bringing up repeatedly. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the single quote. That's more of if you are saying, hey, guess what Lee told me? Then you can do the single quotes for that.
But in the end, the question that you have to ask yourself is if you're communicating what you want to communicate, is the message getting across? And if it is, then that's all that really matters, so long as you are
writing selfishly.
If you have a question or comment for our hosts or a topic you'd like us to cover, send us an email at writingroots@aspenhousepublishing.com or find us on Facebook by searching for Aspen House Publishing.